A shocking murder at Hunterbury House. Elinor Carlisle stands accused, but did she really do it? Watch as Hercule Poirot uncovers the truth in this mind-bending mystery thriller. It was just an ordinary morning when Elinor Carlisle first encountered the letter, its presence on the silver tray, innocuous enough at first glance. The maid had brought it with her breakfast, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she placed the envelope in front of Elinor. There was nothing remarkable about it, no wax seal, no grand embellishments, just an unmarked white envelope with thick, textured paper that felt almost heavy with intent. Elinor, accustomed to the trivialities of everyday life, almost dismissed it as just another of Aunt Laura's endless letters regarding family matters, taxes, and investments. Yet, as her fingers brushed the edge, something about the letter felt different. The weight of the paper, the cold absence of a sender, there was something lurking beneath its surface. She tore it open. The message inside was brief, chilling in its simplicity. "Beware, Elinor. Someone is after your aunt's fortune. They are manipulating her. Watch your back. The inheritance is not safe." Her eyes scanned the words, the cryptic warning swirling in her mind like smoke. Who could have sent this? Who was this nameless figure who claimed to know of secrets hidden behind the grand doors of Hunterbury House? And most importantly, who would dare plot against Aunt Laura, a woman whose wealth was only surpassed by her isolation? Elinor felt a wave of unease. The letter made no sense. But then, as the maid stood there waiting for her to speak, Elinor glanced out of the window at the sprawling gardens. The chirping birds, the rustling of the trees. It was as though the world outside was oblivious to the turmoil beginning to stir within her. Her thoughts began to race. Was it true? Was someone after Laura's fortune? But who? Was it Roddy, her fiancé, who'd always been the charming, disarming figure in her life? Or perhaps Mary, Aunt Laura's beautiful young ward, with her quiet allure and an innocence that never quite seemed real? Elinor shook her head and let out a sigh, forcing herself to dismiss the notion. It was nothing, she thought. Just another piece of nonsense. In a fit of frustration, she crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fire. The flames devoured it eagerly, as if it were no more than a casual inconvenience, leaving only the faintest trace of blackened ash. But that act, that simple, almost dismissive act, would not be forgotten. The ashes would drift away, but the seed of suspicion was planted, and once planted, it would grow in ways Elinor could never have imagined. As she turned back to her breakfast, the sense of unease lingered like a shadow at the edge of her mind. She could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel, each second stretching into eternity. There was something in the air, something thick with the promise of things left unsaid. And though she couldn't see it, she felt it. Hunterbury House watching her, as if it were waiting for something to happen. Something that could never be undone. As Elinor stared at the empty envelope, its silent emptiness seemed to echo louder than the ticking of the clock. What had she missed? But then, she quickly turned her thoughts away, determined not to dwell on it. She would put it out of her mind, she told herself, like any rational woman would. But there was a curious flicker in her heart, a sense of something sinister slipping through the cracks in her mind, something she could not ignore. And though she tried, she would never forget that letter. Cliffhanger ending. The next evening, a knock on the door, soft but deliberate, pulled Elinor from her thoughts. She hadn't expected anyone, least of all a visitor, at this hour. As she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. In the dim light stood a figure, cloaked and hidden in the shadows. A single white envelope was held out to her, and though she could not see the face of the person, she knew this was no ordinary visitor. The envelope, again. Her fingers froze as she reached for it. She knew, even before reading the cryptic words within, that her life had changed forever. And as the figure turned to leave, the soft whisper of a warning hung in the air. It's already begun. The setting. Hunterbury House, a place of secrets. Hunterbury House looms atop the hill, its silhouette casting long shadows against the setting sun, a grim figure against the evening sky. The grand estate, though beautiful in its own way, holds an unsettling presence, a house whose walls seem to have absorbed decades of whispered secrets. The ivy clings to its ancient stone, as if trying to escape the weight of what it's witnessed. Elinor and Roddy's arrival at the gates of Hunterbury House is accompanied by an unspoken tension that neither can ignore. The grand iron gates creak open slowly, the sound echoing through the air like a distant warning. The moment they step out of the carriage, the air feels colder, heavier, an oppressive silence hanging over the estate. Even the wind, usually a gentle companion, seems to carry a more sinister tone, rustling the trees in strange rhythms. The housekeeper, Mrs. Verity, an elderly woman with sharp, watchful eyes, greets them at the door. Her face is pale, her hands trembling slightly as she welcomes them inside, though she hides it well behind a practiced smile. Elinor notices a flicker of something hidden beneath Mrs. Verity's carefully composed facade, a shadow of fear, perhaps, or guilt. As they step inside the hall, the heavy silence presses down on them. The floors creak beneath their feet, as though the house is alive, watching them. The grand chandeliers above cast a dim, flickering light across the entrance hall, adding to the eerie atmosphere. It's an opulent place, but it's a beauty marred by something else. The walls seem to whisper, as if holding on to stories that will never be told. Mrs. Verity speaks in hushed tones, her eyes darting nervously. The house, Miss Carlisle. It has a way of revealing things when the time is right. Strange things, I must warn you. Elinor glances at Roddy, his usual confident smile replaced with a faint unease. She can't help but feel a chill run down her spine. I've heard it too, Mrs. Verity continues, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The noises at night, the wind, it carries strange sounds through these old halls, like voices, whispers that. She falters, her gaze shifting as though she's afraid to speak further. Roddy laughs nervously, trying to brush it off. Superstition, surely. But even he can't mask the doubt in his voice, and Elinor feels a knot form in her stomach. The sense of dread in the air thickens with every step they take deeper into the mansion. She tries to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched never fades. As night falls, the mansion takes on an even more unsettling quality. The wind howls outside, but it's not just the storm that fills the air. It feels as if the house is alive, its dark corners hiding something more sinister. Elinor stands by the window in the sitting room, staring out at the overgrown garden, when she hears it. A faint sound, a footstep, or perhaps a sigh. It seems to come from somewhere deep within the house. She turns to Roddy, who is standing by the fire, looking into the flames with a faraway expression. "Did you hear that?" she asks, her voice trembling slightly. He nods, though his gaze doesn't shift from the fire. Probably the wind, or the house settling. It's an old place, Elinor, nothing more. But Elinor isn't convinced. The air in the room has grown thick, charged with an unspoken energy. She can almost hear the house breathing, its secrets whispering just beyond the reach of her understanding. Suddenly there's a loud, unmistakable sound, a heavy thud, followed by a low groan, as if the very walls are stretching in protest. Elinor jumps, her heart racing. "What was that?" she gasps. Roddy's eyes flash with a flicker of something, fear perhaps, but he quickly masks it with a forced smile. "Nothing. I'll check it out." He moves toward the hallway, but there's something about the way he walks, almost as though he's dreading what he might find. Elinor watches him disappear into the darkness of the house, her anxiety growing. She can feel it now, the palpable presence of someone lurking just out of sight. The shadows seem to grow longer with every passing moment, as if the house is alive, its ancient walls closing in around her. And then the whispers return, faint but undeniable, low and urgent, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach. Elinor shivers, but she can't tear herself away from the window. The wind howls louder, and the shadows stretch across the room, reaching for her. Is it the wind, or is something or someone waiting for her to discover what the house has hidden for so many years? The clock chimes in the distance, its sound echoing through the halls like a death knell. Something is coming, something ancient, something tied to the very foundation of Hunterbury House. But Elinor can't yet see it. A slow creak comes from the staircase. Cliffhanger ending. She is not alone. The intriguing players, motives and shadows. Elinor Carlisle, the devoted niece. Elinor Carlisle, the sole niece of the wealthy and powerful Roddy Welman, had always been the model of filial devotion. Beautiful, kind-hearted, and fiercely loyal, she had spent her life caring for her aunt, making countless sacrifices to ensure Laura's comfort. The two had a bond that went deeper than mere family ties. Elinor was Laura's confidant, the person her aunt trusted more than anyone in the world. But even the most steadfast of hearts can be deceived. Elinor's eyes, usually clear and full of warmth, have begun to show signs of doubt as the events surrounding Hunterbury House unfold. She has never been one to question the motives of those around her until now. What began as a minor, almost laughable concern, the mysterious letter, warning her of someone trying to manipulate her aunt, now gnaws at her like a persistent itch. There's something lurking beneath the surface, something darker, and Elinor can feel it creeping ever closer. As she watches the shifting shadows of Hunterbury House, a place that had once been her sanctuary, she begins to question every person in her life. Could they be the ones playing a dangerous game with her aunt's wealth? Her own mind betrays her as suspicion grows, casting a veil over her once pure world. Could her own fiancé be hiding something? The pain of the truth will come at a high cost, for Elinor is on the verge of losing everything she holds dear: her family, her reputation, and perhaps even her sanity. Roddy Welman, the charming fiancé. Roddy Welman was a man who wore charm as effortlessly as a tailored suit. His broad smile and reassuring words were enough to calm anyone's fears until now. To Elinor, he had always been the perfect partner. He was caring, attentive, and the two seemed destined for a future filled with love and happiness. But as the weight of the inheritance looms over them, Roddy's behavior begins to shift in subtle, unsettling ways. There are moments when Elinor catches him staring out of the window, lost in thought. His charming exterior sometimes cracks, revealing a flicker of something darker, something Elinor can't quite place. It's as though he's keeping a secret that stretches back far longer than their engagement. Is it a secret of love, or is it a secret of greed? Roddy's feelings for Elinor, once so sure, now seem distant, almost mechanical. His attention shifts to others with alarming ease, particularly to the alluring and perfect Mary Gerrard, who seems to possess an ethereal charm that even Elinor can't deny. The growing closeness between Roddy and Mary feels like a betrayal, a whisper in the back of Elinor's mind, telling her that something is terribly wrong. Roddy, ever the smooth talker, insists that nothing is amiss. He promises Elinor that his heart is still hers, that his loyalty remains unbroken. But when Elinor begins to uncover a series of secrets, the picture becomes less clear. What is he hiding? Is he truly in love with her, or is he simply playing a role in a far more dangerous game? And if he is lying to her, who else is he deceiving? Who else is he working with? Elinor's world begins to fracture as she tries to piece together the truth, all while the shadows of suspicion cast doubt upon her fiancé. She can feel the noose tightening around her, but each time she reaches for the truth, it slips further from her grasp. The lies grow more intricate, the stakes higher, and the danger more palpable. The cliffhanger ending. As Elinor stands in the drawing room, watching Roddy from across the room, a thought flickers through her mind, a thought so dreadful, so impossible, that she shudders to entertain it. Is Roddy part of a plot to take her aunt's fortune? Could the love they once shared have been nothing more than a well-played ruse, a means to an end? Suddenly Roddy turns to her, his eyes meeting hers, and for a brief moment, something shifts in his gaze. It's not love she sees in his eyes, but something far colder. A flicker of calculation, of intent. And then, as if on cue, a knock comes at the door. A knock that Elinor knows will change everything. Who stands on the other side of the door? And what devastating truth will Elinor uncover next? Mary Gerrard, the lodgekeeper's beautiful daughter. Mary Gerrard entered the world of Hunterbury House like a breath of fresh, unsettling air. As the daughter of the lodgekeeper, she should have remained a background figure, someone with little importance to the affairs of the grand estate. But there was something about Mary that could not be ignored. She was not just beautiful. She was radiant, with an ethereal quality that drew the eye of anyone who crossed her path. With her flawless skin and silken dark hair, she was almost too perfect, too flawless in a world rife with flaws. Aunt Laura Welman, who had longed for beauty and elegance in her twilight years, adored Mary. She treated her like a daughter, almost as though she saw in her the picture of youth and vitality that she herself had long since lost. It was a strange and unsettling affection that Elinor, her devoted niece, could not quite understand. Why was Aunt Laura so fixated on Mary? And why did it seem like Mary accepted the adoration without so much as a blink? Mary's smile was a weapon, charming, warm, and seemingly sincere. But Elinor couldn't shake the feeling that there was more lurking beneath it. There was a coldness in Mary's eyes, a calculated gleam that spoke of something far darker. She didn't belong to the world of Hunterbury House. She was an outsider, and yet she had woven herself so tightly into the fabric of this aristocratic world that it was as if she had always been meant to be there. Aunt Laura trusted her implicitly, leaving her to oversee everything from the upkeep of the estate to the care of the elderly woman herself. But Elinor couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that Mary wasn't just after her aunt's affection. There was something more at play. Was it the fortune? Was it power? Or was there something even darker? Something that tied Mary's fate to that of the Welman family in a way that no one could yet understand. It was the night of Aunt Laura's stroke when Elinor noticed something odd. As she rushed to her aunt's side, she saw Mary standing at the door, watching the scene unfold with a look of detached curiosity. Was it concern for her aunt, or was it something else? A momentary flash of something unreadable crossed Mary's face before she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the hall. It was as though she had been waiting for this very moment, her reaction too calculated, too cold. Elinor's mind raced. Was Mary more involved in the family's affairs than she appeared? Was she playing a deeper game? Nurse Hopkins, a woman too composed, too knowing. Nurse Hopkins had always been an enigma to Elinor. Composed to a fault, she carried herself with an air of professional detachment. She had been hired to care for Aunt Laura after her stroke, but there was something about the woman's demeanor that unsettled Elinor. Every word she spoke was measured, every gesture deliberate. She never seemed flustered, never appeared overwhelmed, even when the tension in the house reached its peak. Nurse Hopkins' cold, precise manner made her seem like an outsider in the house. She wasn't a family member, not even a friend, yet she commanded respect as if she had a greater claim to the estate than anyone else. Her steely gray eyes were always observing, always analyzing. But what was she really looking for? Elinor often caught the nurse watching her, her gaze lingering just a little too long, as if she were weighing some invisible truth. Despite the nurse's impeccable care of Aunt Laura, something about her presence unnerved Elinor. Nurse Hopkins seemed to know far too much about the Welman family's affairs. She spoke with an unsettling authority, as if she had always been part of the inner circle. Elinor began to wonder, what was Nurse Hopkins' real connection to the family? Why did she seem so intent on remaining at Hunterbury House, even after Aunt Laura's health declined? As the tension between the family members reached a boiling point, Elinor began to notice the nurse's strange behavior. On one occasion, Elinor overheard Nurse Hopkins in the hall, speaking in hushed tones to someone, her voice low but urgent. Who was she speaking to? And why did she seem to be warning someone, her words dripping with hidden meaning? But it wasn't just her conversations that troubled Elinor. It was the way she carried herself, the way she seemed to be always just one step ahead. Nurse Hopkins was always calm, even in moments of crisis, always prepared. She didn't seem rattled by the tragedies unfolding at Hunterbury House. If anything, she seemed to anticipate them. Was she playing a long game? What was her true role in the family's unraveling? Cliffhanger ending. As Elinor paced the dimly lit corridor, her thoughts were consumed with Mary and Nurse Hopkins, two women whose motives seemed so obscured by the shadows that they could not be trusted. Her heart raced, knowing that time was running out to uncover the truth. The manor, with all its secrets, was closing in on her, and she could feel herself being drawn into something far darker than she had ever imagined. Just then, Elinor's breath caught in her throat. Through the crack in the door, she caught sight of a figure, Nurse Hopkins, standing in the hallway, her back turned, speaking in a low whisper to someone just out of sight. The tone was urgent, tinged with what sounded like fear. Elinor stepped forward, her hand shaking as she reached for the door handle. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the voice from the hallway, faint but unmistakable, cut through the silence. "She must not find out. Not yet. The plan must go forward as we agreed." Elinor froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to know who was Nurse Hopkins speaking to. What were they planning? Was Elinor the next target? The door creaked open just a fraction more, but before Elinor could catch another word, the figure turned sharply. Nurse Hopkins' eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, Elinor saw something that chilled her to the bone, an unmistakable flash of recognition, followed by something else, something far darker. The question remains, who else is involved in this sinister game, and just how far will they go to keep the truth hidden? Peter Lord, the doctor who cannot let go. Dr. Peter Lord was more than just a physician. He was a man torn between duty and a personal conviction that seemed to cloud his judgment. A man of intelligence, respect, and professionalism, Peter had earned a reputation as a reliable and compassionate doctor. But in the shadow of Hunterbury House, something about him felt off-kilter, as if a delicate balance between reason and emotion was slowly unraveling. Peter had first crossed paths with Elinor Carlisle at the height of the tension surrounding her aunt's sudden stroke. Elinor had been shattered by the event, and Peter's professional calmness had offered her a modicum of comfort in an otherwise harrowing moment. But it wasn't just his medical expertise that had drawn her in, it was his quiet, steady presence. His eyes, soft with concern, seemed to see more than just her symptoms. They saw the layers of grief, the questions that had been building in her mind. There was a tenderness in his gaze that Elinor hadn't experienced in a long time, a warmth that she hadn't expected to find amid the coldness of the Welman family. What started as professional duty on his part slowly grew into something more personal. He listened to Elinor in a way that no one else did, sensing the weight of the burden she carried, and wanting to offer his help, his understanding. Yet there was something dangerously blinding in Peter's attachment to her. As he spent more time with Elinor, his focus shifted from his medical expertise to his desire to prove her innocence in a case that seemed to grow darker with every passing day. The rumors swirled: was Elinor involved in her aunt's stroke? Did she have a motive to claim the family fortune? Peter could not bear the thought of Elinor being suspected. He saw only the woman who had captured his heart, the woman who stood alone in a house full of conspiracies and hidden truths. He told himself that he was only trying to help her, to clear her name. But the lines between professional duty and personal desire blurred with every whispered rumor, every look he gave her. Was his commitment to proving her innocence driven by love or by something deeper, something he himself couldn't acknowledge? His obsession with Elinor's case soon grew dangerously obsessive. He spent hours combing through medical records, old family accounts, and whispered conversations, desperately trying to find something that would prove Elinor's innocence. But the more he uncovered, the more he began to doubt his own reasoning. Was he blinded by love, or was there truly something sinister at play within the walls of Hunterbury House? Elinor began to notice the change in him. He had always been kind, but now there was an edge to his compassion. His gaze lingered on her longer than necessary. His words were carefully chosen to convey a closeness that had not existed before. But Elinor couldn't help but wonder. Was he trying to protect her, or was he trying to manipulate her into believing something that wasn't entirely true? His growing desire to protect her seemed to override his clinical detachment. Peter's connection to Elinor became his own prison. He knew too much, and yet not enough to see the full picture. His passion for her innocence blinded him to the truths he needed to uncover. And it wasn't just his attachment to her that was dangerous, it was the growing sense of desperation within him. The more he tried to prove her innocence, the more the walls around him began to close in. Cliffhanger ending. One night, as the house grew still and Elinor retreated into her thoughts, She found Peter standing at the window of the drawing room, staring out into the darkened landscape. His face was drawn with a mixture of frustration and something else, something far more unsettling. As she stepped closer, he turned, his eyes locking with hers, a strange intensity radiating from them. "Elinor." Peter's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was a tremor in it, as though he were about to reveal something that would change everything. "I found something. Something that could clear your name. But—" He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the shadows that seemed to linger in the corners of the room. "But it's not what it seems. There's something I'm not telling you. I don't know if you're ready to hear it." Elinor's heart raced. She stepped forward, her pulse quickening with a mix of dread and anticipation. "Peter, what are you saying? What have you found?" He closed his eyes, as though trying to steady himself, but when he spoke again, his words were like a cold dagger. "There's someone else involved. Someone far closer than you think. Someone who has been orchestrating this entire thing." Peter took a slow step back, his hand gripping the back of a chair as if to anchor himself. "And Elinor, it might be someone you trust." Before Elinor could ask another question, Peter turned abruptly, heading toward the door, his face a mask of conflict. His words hung in the air, unanswered, as the door creaked open. "Elinor, don't trust anyone." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Elinor standing alone, her thoughts racing. She had thought Peter was the one person she could trust. But now, his words echoed in her mind, leaving her shaken, uncertain of who she could rely on. Was it Peter himself who was hiding something? Or was there someone more sinister lurking in the shadows, manipulating them all? Who could Elinor truly trust? And what truth was Peter hiding? One that could shatter everything she thought she knew. The first stroke, Aunt Laura's mysterious words. The air in Hunterbury House was thick with tension that day. Aunt Laura, once a woman full of life and vigor, was now confined to her bed, half paralyzed from a sudden stroke. The great mansion, always bustling with the hum of activity, seemed eerily silent as Elinor entered her aunt's room. The dim light from the window cast long shadows across the ornate furniture, and the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner felt louder than ever. Aunt Laura's once sharp, commanding voice was now reduced to a whisper, her words barely escaping her parched lips. Her face, pale and drawn, seemed more a mask of suffering than the woman Elinor had known for so long. But despite the frailty, there was something unsettling about the way she looked at her niece. A glint of urgency in her dimming eyes. "Elinor." Aunt Laura's voice broke through the silence, barely audible, as she reached out feebly for her niece's hand. There's something you need to know. Something. I need to change it. Change the will." The words were strained, almost incomprehensible. But Elinor caught the tremor in her aunt's voice, the desperate, almost frantic edge. Aunt Laura's fingers twitched, weak and trembling, as though fighting for the strength to say something vital. But before Elinor could press for more information, Aunt Laura's voice faltered, her grip slackened, and her head fell back onto the pillow. She had slipped into unconsciousness again, leaving only a lingering sense of foreboding in the air. Elinor's heart pounded in her chest. What had Aunt Laura been trying to say, and why had she wanted to change the will? The thought hung over her like a cloud, dark and heavy. Her thoughts were interrupted by Nurse Hopkins, who entered the room quietly, her presence as always calm and unshakable. She checked Aunt Laura's pulse, her face impassive. But Elinor could see the concern in the nurse's eyes. She was no stranger to the signs of stroke, but something in the nurse's gaze betrayed her unawareness that something was not quite right. As the evening drew on, Aunt Laura seemed to drift in and out of consciousness. She mumbled incoherently at times, but there was one word that kept slipping from her lips over and over: betrayal. The night grew colder, the wind howling outside the mansion as if nature itself was mourning. Elinor stayed at her aunt's side, trying to decipher the cryptic words. But before she could make sense of them, Aunt Laura's condition worsened rapidly. A second stroke. This time there was no coming back. Cliffhanger ending. Elinor was left standing over her aunt's lifeless body, the weight of the loss sinking into her chest like a stone. The house was still. The silence was deafening. The room felt colder than before, as if something in the air had shifted. A feeling of dread pressed in on her, tightening around her chest. But it was the absence of the will that set her heart racing. In the chaos of the night, as the doctors had arrived and the family members were notified, there was no will to be found. No document, no trace of Aunt Laura's final wishes. It was as if the very thing that could explain everything, her strange words, her urgent need to change her will, had disappeared with her. And then, as the reality began to set in, the servants arrived with the shocking news. Elinor, as the only surviving relative, was now the sole inheritor of the entire estate. Her heart skipped a beat. The sudden weight of responsibility, of what had just happened, was overwhelming. But in the back of her mind, one thought gnawed at her relentlessly. Had Aunt Laura's last words been a warning? Had she known something? Had she been trying to protect Elinor from something dark lurking within the walls of Hunterbury House? As Elinor stood alone in the silence of her aunt's room, a chill ran down her spine. The sense of unease that had hung over the house for days had only deepened. And then, as if the mansion itself were breathing, the wind howled again through the darkened halls, rattling the windows. A flash of movement caught her eye. There, in the shadows by the door, someone was watching her. Who was it, and what did Aunt Laura's last words truly mean? The fracture, love, betrayal, and a death most foul. The days following Aunt Laura's death felt like a blur to Elinor. The weight of her inheritance, of everything she now owned, settled on her shoulders like an unbearable burden. Yet, it was not the house, nor the fortune that weighed on her most. It was the unraveling of everything she had once believed to be true. And at the heart of it all was Roddy, her fiancé, the man who had promised to love her, to stand by her side through thick and thin. But now, as Elinor stood in the parlor one evening, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the walls, she saw the truth in his eyes, a truth that shattered her heart. Roddy had fallen in love with Mary Gerrard. Elinor watched, helpless, as Roddy gazed at Mary with a tenderness she had once known. He hadn't even bothered to soften the blow. No apologies, no explanations. He simply turned to Elinor one morning and said the words that would end everything between them. "Elinor, I can't do this anymore. I'm in love with Mary. I'm sorry. I'm ending our engagement." The words were like a slap in the face. Elinor couldn't even speak, couldn't process what had just happened. Her world, her carefully built world, had cracked open, and she felt herself falling, unable to stop. Did Mary plan this? Was this part of her scheme? The question burned in Elinor's mind. Could Mary have orchestrated Roddy's infatuation, playing her role in the drama perfectly? Or was it something more sinister, something tied to the cryptic letter Elinor had received, the one warning her that someone was manipulating her aunt for the fortune? The thought twisted in her gut, and a darkness she had never known before began to grow. Jealousy. She could feel it, a hot, bitter jealousy, gnawing at her insides. She could barely look at Mary without feeling a searing hatred. Mary, with her flawless beauty, her sweet, innocent charm, how had she stolen Roddy away so easily? But Elinor had no time to wallow in her heartbreak. A few days later, tragedy struck again. Mary Gerrard, the picture of health just days before, was found dead in her room, morphine poisoning. At first, it seemed like an accident, a careless overdose, but the more the authorities investigated, the more the pieces began to fall into place. A bottle of morphine, unlocked, left carelessly in Mary's room. Too easy, too convenient. The circumstances began to point toward one person, Elinor. She had the motive of a woman scorned. She had the opportunity. After all, she had been in and out of the house, tending to the details of Aunt Laura's estate. Could Elinor have done it? Could she have poisoned Mary, driven by jealousy and hurt? The more Elinor tried to explain herself, the more the walls seemed to close in. The people she once trusted, her own family, the servants, began to turn their eyes away from her, casting doubt upon her every action. Peter Lord, the doctor who had been a constant support during Aunt Laura's illness, seemed convinced that Elinor was innocent, But even his voice of reason began to sound distant, like a whisper in a storm. Roddy, for his part, was barely speaking to her. His guilt over Mary's death was palpable, and yet his eyes never quite met Elinor's when he spoke. He avoided her as if afraid of the truth. They both knew the truth, that Elinor was the prime suspect. Cliffhanger ending. Elinor stood alone in the hallway, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She was trapped in a prison of suspicion, her every step now shadowed by the specter of Mary's death. The silence in the house was deafening, every corner filled with eyes that seemed to judge her, question her. But just as Elinor's thoughts seemed to spiral, a soft knock on the door interrupted her. She turned. Standing in the doorway was Nurse Hopkins. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her hand, something Elinor couldn't quite make out. Nurse Hopkins stepped into the room, her gaze steady. "Elinor," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "There's something you need to see, something that might change everything." The nurse's hand trembled slightly as she passed Elinor a small, weathered envelope. The seal was broken, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the same as the letter Elinor had burned. Elinor's heart raced as she slowly opened the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were scrawled hastily, almost as if written in fear. "Elinor, I know what you're thinking, but you're looking in the wrong direction. The true enemy is still in the shadows." And then, beneath it, there was a name. Roddy Welman. Who had sent this letter, and what did it mean for Elinor? Could Roddy truly be the one behind the murder, or was someone else pulling the strings from the shadows? As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Elinor couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. The deeper she dug, the more she realized she might be playing a game she could never win. The trial. A woman against the world. The cold, unforgiving walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on Elinor Carlisle as she sat in the defendant's chair, the weight of her fate pressing down on her chest. Her once pristine reputation, built on years of wealth and privilege, now lay in tatters, ripped apart by the scandal of Mary Gerrard's death. The media had latched onto the story with ravenous hunger, painting Elinor as a heartless woman scorned, a jealous fiancé who murdered the woman who stole her love. The courtroom was a spectacle. Journalists, with their pens poised and cameras flashing, gathered in droves to capture every moment of Elinor's unraveling. Each headline seemed to twist the truth a little further. Wealthy heiress faces murder charge. And jealousy and betrayal. The tragic fate of Mary Gerrard were plastered across the front pages of newspapers. The public, fascinated by the fall of a woman who once seemed untouchable, couldn't get enough. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a picture of a woman driven to the edge, consumed by jealousy and greed. Elinor's motive was clear. She had everything to gain from Mary's death. The inheritance, the house, the love of Roddy Welman, all of it would be hers if Mary were out of the picture. The evidence seemed damning. The morphine bottle, the locked doors, Elinor's proximity to the crime, everything pointed to her. But Elinor knew one thing for sure: she didn't do it. Yet, despite her protests, despite the tears that welled up in her eyes as she tried to explain herself, no one seemed to believe her. Her fate had been sealed, it seemed. The judge's gavel came down again and again, each strike a hammer blow to her already fragile hopes of being acquitted. Poirot's entrance. But even as the trial spiraled out of control, there was one man who refused to accept the case as it appeared: Hercule Poirot. The famous detective, having been drawn to the case by an old acquaintance who had heard whispers about the trial, arrived in the courtroom just as the tension reached its peak. His calm demeanor, his impeccable suit, and his air of quiet authority immediately captured the attention of everyone in the room. Poirot was not interested in the obvious. He knew the truth was never as simple as it seemed. He studied Elinor with a gaze that was both sympathetic and calculating, as though he could see through the walls she had built around herself. When the opportunity came for him to speak, his voice was a beacon of reason amidst the chaos. "The facts, mes amis, are not as they seem," Poirot said, his accent thick but his words clear. "There is something more here, something hidden beneath the surface, A woman such as Mademoiselle Carlisle, driven to murder out of jealousy. Non, this is not the truth. The room fell silent, the murmurs from the crowd fading into nothing, as Poirot's words hung in the air. Elinor's eyes widened with hope. For the first time since the trial began, someone believed her, someone with the power to expose the truth. But would it be enough? Would Poirot's sharp mind be able to piece together the fragments of this shattered puzzle? The courtroom drama unfolds. The trial continued, but now there was a sense of electricity in the air. The tension was palpable, thick as smoke. Elinor's defense team, bolstered by Poirot's presence, began to dig deeper into the evidence, scrutinizing every detail. The case against her seemed airtight, but Poirot's keen eye found cracks, places where the evidence didn't quite line up. He began to ask questions that made people uncomfortable. Why had Mary been in possession of morphine, a drug she had no use for? Who had access to the medicine cabinet? And most importantly, who stood to gain the most from her death? As Poirot peeled back the layers, the truth started to emerge, like a shadow slowly being illuminated by a flickering candle. Each new discovery seemed to shake the foundation of the case, each clue pointing away from Elinor and toward someone else entirely. Cliffhanger ending. Just as it seemed like Poirot might be on the verge of a breakthrough, the courtroom door swung open and a figure stepped into the room. A figure Elinor never expected to see again: Roddy Welman. Roddy's appearance in the courtroom was an immediate shock. He had been avoiding Elinor's gaze for weeks, his guilt over Mary's death eating away at him. But now, he walked with a strange confidence, his eyes steely, as if he had come to make a decision once and for all. He took a seat in the witness box, looking directly at Elinor, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room reached a fever pitch as the crowd waited for him to speak. "Roddy," Elinor whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Roddy turned his gaze toward her, and for a moment it seemed like the whole world held its breath. "I've been silent long enough," he said quietly, his voice almost too calm. "But it's time to tell the truth." Elinor's heart raced. What was he going to say? Had he come to confess the truth? Had he finally realized that she was innocent? Or was he about to throw her under the bus once more? Just as the room prepared to hear what Roddy had to say, Poirot's voice cut through the silence. "Mais non, Monsieur Welman. You will not have the last word. The truth is far more complex than you believe." What secret did Roddy hold? Was he a victim of circumstance, or was he the true culprit behind Mary's death? Could Poirot's brilliance uncover the final piece of the puzzle? The investigation. Poirot enters the game. The air in the room was thick with tension as Hercule Poirot entered the scene, his small frame cutting through the crowd like a sharp needle threading through fabric. The room fell silent at once, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of what he might say. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned every inch of the courtroom, taking in the subtle cues that others would overlook: the flutter of a hand, the shift of an eye, the tension in a voice. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he simply observed, his hands clasped neatly behind his back, his face calm and unreadable. His mind, however, was a whirlwind of activity, piecing together fragments of information, connecting dots no one else had even considered. The letter, he thought, the first warning. The letter had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited the chain of events leading to this point. Who had written it? Who had known that something terrible was about to happen? Poirot's mind danced over the possibilities. A person close to the house, a hidden enemy, or perhaps someone with a far more personal motive. The sandwiches or the tea? Poirot's investigation led him into the most intimate details of that fateful afternoon. Elinor, her fiancé Roddy, Mary Gerrard, and Nurse Hopkins had all gathered in the drawing room, enjoying an afternoon tea. The sandwiches, the tea, the way the guests laughed and chatted, each detail had been so ordinary, so deceptively innocent. Yet the poison that killed Mary had come from one of those things. Was the poison in the sandwiches or the tea? Poirot turned the question over and over in his mind. No one knew for sure. Some believed it had to be the tea. the last thing Mary had drunk before she collapsed, her face contorted in agony. Others suggested the sandwiches, which she had nibbled on absent-mindedly, perhaps not noticing the slow burn of the poison taking effect. But Poirot knew better. The smallest detail could hold the biggest answer. He wasn't concerned with what everyone thought had happened. He was concerned with what had actually happened, and for that, he needed to go deeper. The clue in plain sight. Nurse Hopkins' scratch. Poirot's gaze narrowed as he watched Nurse Hopkins. She had been a calm, composed presence since the beginning of the investigation, her carefully chosen words always measured and controlled. But there was something off. Something in her posture, the way she scratched the back of her neck with a quick, nervous motion, as if she was trying to hide something. Why had she scratched herself? It was the most innocent of gestures, yet Poirot knew better than to dismiss anything as trivial. There was a reason why people did what they did, why they moved in certain ways, why they acted with such precision. In that simple scratch, Poirot saw a flicker of guilt, an unconscious gesture that betrayed a hidden truth. The truth, as always, was hidden in plain sight. Was Nurse Hopkins's behavior a sign of nerves, perhaps a guilty conscience, or was she simply trying to deflect attention from something more important? Poirot's mind whirred with possibilities. Was she involved in the murder? Did she have something to hide? Or was she the victim of a cruel coincidence, a pawn in a much larger game? The subtle manipulations of Roddy Welman. And then there was Roddy Welman, Elinor's once loyal fiancé, whose affections had turned like a snake, slithering away from her, and toward Mary Gerrard. Poirot had been watching him closely. Roddy's behavior had been odd, had shown no visible grief over Mary's death, no real emotion other than perhaps frustration. And now, with Poirot observing, he seemed unnervingly calm, too calm. His eyes darted between the other suspects, calculating, as if he was waiting for the right moment to speak. What did he know? Was he simply guilty of betrayal, or was he hiding something more sinister? The truth lies beneath. A web of lies and deceit. Poirot's method was always the same. He dug beneath the surface. He listened to the words people spoke, but he was more interested in what they left unsaid. In the flicker of their eyes, in the way they shifted their weight, in the subtle shifts of body language, all of it told a story, one that could reveal the truth, if one was willing to look closely enough. As Poirot pondered the case, he began to understand something crucial. The murder was not as it seemed. It wasn't about a jealous fiancé or a lover's quarrel. There was something darker at play here, something that went beyond personal grievances. Someone was playing a game, manipulating everyone, pulling strings from the shadows. And Elinor, despite being accused, might not be the true culprit at all. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked across the room, catching each person's gaze, measuring them. "There is something you are all missing," he said, his voice calm, but cutting through the tension like a knife. "The truth lies beneath, and I shall uncover it." Just as Poirot was about to reveal the first of his conclusions, the door to the room slammed open. A figure stepped into the doorway, a letter in their hand. Their face was obscured in shadow, but their presence was unmistakable. The room fell into an unnatural silence. Poirot's expression hardened. He had been right about one thing. The letter was key. But who had written it? And what new twist did it bring? Before anyone could react, the figure in the doorway stepped forward. In their hand was the very letter that had set everything in motion, and as they placed it on the table in front of Poirot, they said one chilling sentence. "You've been looking in the wrong place, Monsieur Poirot. The answer lies where you least expect it." And with that, the room erupted in chaos. Who was this mysterious figure? What did they know that Poirot didn't? The reveal. A murderer unmasked. The courtroom was a powder keg of tension, and with each passing second, the anticipation grew thicker, wrapping around every person in the room like a suffocating fog. Eyes were glued to Hercule Poirot, who stood at the center of the drama, poised like a conductor about to reveal the crescendo of a complex symphony. Silence reigned, the silence before the storm. Poirot's gaze swept the room one last time, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he met the gaze of Nurse Hopkins. The calm, composed woman who had so skillfully played the role of the innocent bystander, the dutiful caretaker. The very woman whose suspicious scratching of her neck had first caught Poirot's attention. She had been the perfect chameleon, blending into the background while keeping her true intentions hidden. But Poirot had never been fooled. And now, with a single, devastating revelation, he shattered everything. Nurse Hopkins is not who she claims to be. The words rang out like the crack of a whip, cutting through the tense air, drawing every eye to the accused. The courtroom gasped in unison, a collective intake of breath that reverberated through the room. The murmurs grew louder as Poirot's next words unfurled with the weight of a confession. She is Mary Draper, Mary Gerrard's long-lost relative from New Zealand. A ripple of disbelief spread across the room, but Poirot was far from finished. His sharp eyes flicked back to Nurse Hopkins, whose composed expression was now beginning to crack, the mask of calm slipping ever so slightly. If Mary had lived, she would have inherited everything. Poirot continued, his voice steady but laden with purpose. But Miss Draper, or should I say Nurse Hopkins, had no intention of letting that happen. The room was electric now, filled with gasps, exclamations, and rising confusion. The prosecutor looked as if he had been struck, his face turning pale, as though the ground beneath him had just caved in. Elinor's face drained of color, her mouth agape, still processing the enormity of Poirot's claim. The motive, a hidden legacy. Poirot's gaze never left Nurse Hopkins as he stepped forward, his voice growing colder, sharper. Nurse Hopkins knew that the moment Mary Gerrard inherited the estate, her own claim would be wiped out. Her legacy, her fortune would vanish, and so she played her part. She became the quiet observer, the ever-present shadow, keeping everyone in line while waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The truth was beginning to piece itself together in the minds of the spectators, but Poirot wasn't finished yet. He knew there was more. There had to be more. The deception. A carefully crafted mask. Poirot's mind raced back to the smallest details, the ones that had seemed so insignificant at first, the way Nurse Hopkins had always been just a little too calm, too composed, too knowledgeable about certain things. The way she had slipped into the role of Mary Gerrard's caretaker, as if it were second nature. Her knowledge of Mary's habits, her obsession with the house's inner workings, her strange hidden interactions with the staff, it had all been building toward this moment. You see, Mary Draper didn't just want to inherit the estate. Poirot pressed, his eyes never leaving Nurse Hopkins. She wanted to replace Mary Gerrard. She wanted to erase the young woman who had been the rightful heir, taking her place as the favored niece of Aunt Laura. But when that plan was foiled by Mary's untimely death, Nurse Hopkins had no choice but to carry out her backup plan. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. People shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes darting from Poirot to Nurse Hopkins, whose once perfect mask had finally slipped entirely. Her hands were shaking, her eyes darting around, as if searching for an escape. But there was no way out. Not now. The poison. The final stroke of deception. Poirot's voice grew quieter now, drawing the room into a hushed silence as he revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Mary Gerrard did not die by accident. She died by the hands of someone who knew exactly how to execute the perfect crime. The morphine was the tool, yes, but it was the timing that mattered. Nurse Hopkins had ensured that no one would ever suspect her. She watched Mary die slowly, all the while playing the role of the dutiful caregiver, the woman who was always there, comforting, supporting, until it was too late. Cliffhanger ending. As the courtroom fell into an eerie silence, Poirot took a step back, his final words hanging in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. But now, Poirot said, his voice soft but firm, we must ask ourselves one final question. Why, Miss Draper, why go through such lengths to kill the woman you once cared for? Was there something else behind it? Was someone pulling your strings? What, or who, drove you to this act of unspeakable cruelty? The room was on the edge of collapse, each person holding their breath, desperately waiting for the answer that would come. But Poirot had left them with more than a question. He had left them with a cliffhanger that would tear their minds apart. The scratch, A hidden sinister truth. The courtroom had fallen into an unnatural silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Poirot stood like a statue in the center of the room, his gaze locked onto Nurse Hopkins, whose composure had shattered the moment he made his earlier revelation. But Poirot wasn't finished yet. No, he had yet to reveal the final, most damning piece of the puzzle. His voice was calm, measured, but every word dripped with the weight of truth. "The scratch," Poirot began, his eyes narrowing. "It was not from a rose, as Nurse Hopkins claimed. No, my friends, it was something much more sinister, much more carefully planned." The audience leaned in, the tension mounting with every word. Elinor, whose face had been pale with shock, now looked as though she were slowly beginning to understand the depths of the treachery that had been committed against her. Poirot continued, his words like blades carving the truth from the shadows. "That scratch," Poirot continued, "was not an innocent accident. It was the result of an injection administered by Nurse Hopkins herself. It was a calculated move, one that ensured she could vomit out the poison she had administered to poor Mary Gerrard, and in doing so, fake her innocence. The poison was never meant to kill Gerrard, was only meant to make her appear to be the victim of a terrible, accidental overdose." A stunned silence enveloped the room. The prosecution, the defense, and the spectators were all frozen in disbelief, struggling to process the twisted depths of Nurse Hopkins' deceit. She had played her part so well. She had fooled everyone, the doctors, the family, the staff. She had been the perfect picture of calm and kindness, until Poirot unraveled the truth. "You see, Nurse Hopkins had no intention of taking her own life," Poirot added, his voice filled with disgust. "She had only one goal, to frame Elinor Carlisle." The young woman, unaware of the dark plans unfolding around her, had become the perfect scapegoat for a crime she did not commit. The shock in the room was palpable. Elinor's hand shot to her mouth, as though trying to stifle the wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. She had been trapped in a web of lies spun by someone she had trusted. Someone she had never suspected. The poison. The final act of deception. Poirot's eyes flicked toward Nurse Hopkins. No, Mary Draper, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. "You poisoned Mary Gerrard, but you knew she had to survive long enough to play her part in your carefully designed game. You had to make it look as though she had taken the poison herself. And so, you carefully timed everything, calculated each step, ensuring she would fall ill but not die immediately." Poirot's gaze was unwavering now, cutting through the room like a blade. He was watching her carefully, almost as if daring her to speak. But Nurse Hopkins' Mary Draper was silent, her eyes darting nervously. The carefully constructed mask of innocence had slipped entirely now. She knew the game was up. You watched Mary die slowly, carefully ensuring that she would never be the one to take the fall. You poisoned her and then played your part, pretending to care for her, all the while knowing that your true victim, the one who had been set up from the start, was Elinor. The truth was like a hurricane ripping through the courtroom, leaving chaos and disbelief in its wake. But Poirot wasn't finished. He knew that behind this twisted betrayal lay an even darker truth. The question was no longer who had poisoned Mary Gerrard, it was why. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as though speaking directly to Nurse Hopkins, but addressing everyone in the room. "Why, Miss Draper?" Poirot asked, his words hanging in the air. "What drove you to such lengths? Why did you go to such extremes to destroy an innocent woman's life?" The room waited in breathless silence, the tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Even the judge seemed suspended in time, his gavel raised but unmoving. Poirot took a step back, his eyes still fixed on Nurse Hopkins, now practically trembling before him. He could see the guilt written all over her face. She wasn't going to get away with it. But Poirot knew there was more. There had to be more. This wasn't just about one woman's jealousy or greed. There was a deeper, more twisted reason for this carefully orchestrated crime. "The truth will come out," Poirot said quietly, his voice as cold and calm as ever. "But you, Miss Draper, you will not escape what is coming. The truth is always exposed in the end." And with that, Poirot turned on his heel, his gaze lingering on the woman who had almost gotten away with murder. His final words echoed in the silence, leaving a sense of dread in their wake. The game is not yet over. The climax, justice served. The courtroom was electric with anticipation. Every eye was fixed on the doors, waiting for Nurse Hopkins, the woman who had so expertly woven a web of lies, to face justice. Yet, as the final gavel struck, sealing her fate, she was nowhere to be seen. "Where is she?" A voice cried out from the crowd. "Where is Nurse Hopkins?" A hushed murmur swept through the room. The doors to the courtroom remained firmly closed. There was no sign of her. Had she slipped away in the chaos? Had she been whisked out before anyone could notice? Or perhaps, was there something darker at play? Poirot's keen eyes scanned the room, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. His gaze flicked toward the courtroom windows, his sharp mind piecing the puzzle together. "She has vanished," Poirot muttered, barely audible, but heard by those closest to him. His voice was calm, as always, but there was an underlying tension in his words. The room erupted in confusion, with whispers spiraling out of control. Had Nurse Hopkins escaped justice? Had she run off to some distant corner of the world, leaving behind a trail of destruction? The police surged through the courtroom, combing the hallways, checking exits, but she was nowhere to be found. But Poirot knew. There was no escaping the truth. The one thing no criminal could ever outrun was the inescapable weight of the truth itself. The heart of her crime had been exposed. Hopkins, Sir Mary Draper, was lost, trapped in her own web of deceit. Whether she ran or hid, her fate was sealed. The world would know her name now, not as a nurse, not as a savior, but as a woman who killed for money and vengeance. And while Nurse Hopkins vanished into the shadows, the story of Elinor Carlisle took a different turn. The room quieted as Elinor, once accused of murder, stood before the court of free woman. Her acquittal had been swift, undeniable. All the lies had been stripped away, the truth shining through like a beacon in the darkness. Elinor's eyes met Peter Lord's from across the courtroom. For the first time in what felt like forever, her face softened. A wave of relief washed over her. But it wasn't just the verdict that freed her, it was the man who had never once doubted her. Peter's steady gaze, his unwavering belief in her, had been the lifeline she so desperately needed. "We can go now," Peter whispered, his voice gentle, full of promise. Elinor nodded, her heart heavy with everything that had transpired, yet filled with a sense of hope she hadn't known was possible. She had been through the fire, and now, finally, she could leave the ashes behind. Her life, once tangled in lies and suspicion, was hers again. As the two of them walked out of the courtroom, side by side, there was no applause, no grand gesture, just a quiet, determined exit. And yet, as they made their way to the doors, Poirot watched them closely. His eyes followed their every step, a pensive look on his face. For a moment Elinor glanced over her shoulder, meeting Poirot's gaze. It was a silent understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the strange path she had walked, and the strange man who had helped her navigate it. Poirot's lips curled into the faintest of smiles as he watched them disappear into the bustling street, ready to start anew, away from the shadows that had haunted her. But even as he stood there, observing the world outside the courtroom, his mind wandered to the unsolved mysteries of the heart. "The heart," Poirot murmured to himself, his words drifting in the air like an ancient secret. "It is often a greater mystery than the crime itself." The words hung heavy in the air, their weight lingering long after Poirot had turned away from the door, disappearing into the shadows of the city. What truly drives a person to commit a crime? What lies hidden beneath the surface of our relationships? Can love and betrayal ever be fully understood? Poirot walked down the steps, lost in his thoughts, his mind tracing the endless, tangled lines of human nature. The truth had been revealed, but in the end, the most perplexing mystery was still unsolved. As Poirot disappeared into the bustling world, one question remained: what is the true nature of the heart?